Hey, welcome fellow horse nerds. This is going to be a long format, okay, because we're talking history here. So what we've done is we've divided this up into some sections. This is the first of a series of 3, but even this one's quite long. So at about minute 7, I talk about the earliest culture that we know of with this kind of riding, which is the Sintashta. At about minute 11, we find ourselves in Mesopotamia and with a master called Kikkuli. At around minute 16, we find ourselves in Greece with Xenophon. At around minute 23, we are getting into Rome. And around minute 28, we are in the early medieval period, the Goths and all those cool people who collapsed the Roman Empire on their horses, and how the dressage relates to all this. So that will just give you a little bit of geography if you want to skip around. But if you're a nerd like me and you want to listen to the whole thing all the way through to get the big picture, well, hey, I'm with you the whole time. Give it a thumbs up, please. Subscribe. This helps us get the work and the information out there. Now let's jump in. Hey, it's Rupert Isaacson. A lot of you have been asking us for a proper overview of the whole history of this dressage thing, this riding thing. And so we're going to give it a go. We've been highlighting certain old masters, as you know. We've been talking in the last few weeks about Nuno Oliveira and François Robichon de la Guerinière and François Baucher and some others. But these are all quite recent. The history goes back much, much, much further than that. And it's worth understanding this, even if you're not a history nerd. Why? Because then you understand kind of why we do what we do, why things are called what they're called, why certain approaches are used and not others, etc., and how the whole thing developed. And you start to realize that what we call dressage today actually looks quite different to how it looked in earlier times, and that this is a living organism. However, what everyone can agree on is this thing of dressing, literally that word, dressing the horse. And this is where we're sort of going to start, and then we're going to take it on from there. This will be the first of 3. This is going to cover the really early ancient world stuff, and hopefully will take us up into the medieval period. And yes, you do want to know why these old dead dudes wrote what they wrote, because it's going to inform your ride. It really is. And it's going to give you clues into the kind of horse you've got, because these people worked it all out and they were writing about it thousands of years ago. So we can learn. All right. Then there'll be a second one, which will take us through the Renaissance and up into the early modern period, the Baroque period, which is where most of us kind of think it begins, but it doesn't. And then we're going to go into the modern period and eventually talk to some modern masters as well, because they're out there and they're cool and we want to hear from them. All right, so here goes. The first thing you might notice about this video is that I am wearing clothes. All right, I am dressed. If I was eating a salad right now, I might put a salad dressing on it. If I had a cut on my skin, I might put a dressing on it. If I was in the army and the sergeant was screaming at me to check the dressing, he'd want me to be sure that I was 1 arm's length from the man to my right and that all the ranks lines were straight. If a woman was sitting at her dressing table 100 years ago, she wasn't actually putting her clothes on, because when your bottom's on the chair, it's hard to put your clothes on. She was doing her hair and her makeup. She was putting herself together. That is what the word dressage means. It does not mean training. It does not mean really anything specifically to do with horses. It's just an old word for to put together. We get it from the French for some interesting reasons, which I'll go into later. There's a reason why we have all these French words, including dressage. It's no accident. Okay, so what does it mean to put a horse together? In this case, that's what we're doing. We're dressing the horse. Well, if you want to do sort of collected work in 3 dimensions, and that's kind of really what dressage is at the end of the day, it's gathering the horse's energy and then deploying it, sometimes in a balletic way, sometimes in a more practical way. In order to do that, you've got to do one thing. You've got to put the 2 hind legs of the horse under the point of gravity. If that doesn't happen, we can't do all that other stuff. The energy has to be available. Very similar to a martial arts pose in a human, or the way people gather their energy for dance as humans as well. They drop the center of gravity sometimes by a lot if they're fighting, and sometimes by a little bit if they're dancing, and then they can move in 3 dimensions. Exactly the same with a horse. And horses, by the way, do all the dressage stuff that we see, the piaffe, the passage, the pirouettes, the airs above the ground, even obviously the flying changes, even the Spanish walk and things like that. They do them in nature. They're usually behaviors that are associated with passion and play. So they either have to do with fighting, flirting, or playing. And so you'll see the most unlikely horses when they're turned out in a group and they all decide to play, pulling the most spectacular moves. So it's in the horse. We're not teaching the horse to do anything other than what he does in nature or she does in nature anyway. By the way, some people might say, but Spanish walk, that one, it's not natural. Actually, it is. If you've ever kept stallions, when they go round each other before they fight, while they check each other out, they do this thing. So even that they do. I know that because we used to have 3 stallions and they would do that at each other. So, okay. We can only teach the horse to do what he does already in nature. We're actually not teaching him to do it. We're teaching him to do it when a monkey wants him to do it, for as long as the monkey would like him to do it, with a monkey on his back. Well, that's a different thing for a horse. Yes, a training process has to be gone through for that. But to dress the horse, the dressage of the horse, is simply to put him from this long silhouette, where his head is out in front and he's just walking with his weight on the shoulders, to putting the hind legs under, and he can stop, start, spin, and do all the other fancy stuff that he needs to do in 3 dimensions. So that explains the word that we're using, to dress the horse. And there is no one way to do it. Okay, just like there's no one way to do martial arts and there's no one way to dance. But all of the ways of martial arts and all of the ways of dance are related to each other. And if you're good at one, you tend to be able to cross over to other kinds. All right, so that's the origin of the word. Now, where does it all begin? Let's go back into the distant mists of time. It looks like if we go back about 4,000 years, we find ourselves in what is now the Ukrainian steppe and into Western Russia. And it seems that we have a people there called the Sintashta, S-I-N-T, Sintash, A-S-H-T-A, named for a local lake. And it seems that this group of people were the first that archaeologists have been able to identify. This all may change, of course, as other archaeologists come up with something else in 10 years. But for now, this is what we know. They seem to be the first ones to breed the horse for the higher wither. If you look at wild horses, like Przewalski's horses, that sort of thing, you'll notice that they have very, very low withers, and it's very difficult to put a saddle on them and have it stay stable, or to put harness on them for driving. It seems that these people began to selectively breed horses for this purpose, not just the physical type, but also for temperament, selecting the ones that were the most human-oriented, the most trainable, breeding for trainability, breeding for the morphology of this higher wither, this shorter back in certain cases, and so on. It seems that the bulk of their legacy, as we know, it was largely about chariot driving, but they certainly seem to have been riding as well, because they were herding livestock. And if you're herding livestock with horses, you're going to do that from the back of a horse. But their battle work seems to have been mostly chariots out on this open steppe. And you can sort of see why these would have been the first sort of tanks of the time. However, very, very quickly after that, mounted archery comes in. And with mounted archery, the horse is not yet really dressed. The horse can run in an elongated form without reins, and the rider has to have all the skill in the archery. But there has to be a finesse in the riding, because everything's got to be controlled with weight, legs, voice, etc., because the hand can't really come into it. It seems that somewhere after that, probably around 3,500 years ago, we see the first close combat cavalry. And close combat cavalry almost certainly came out of livestock work. So when you work cows, if any of you are Western riders, and you've actually gone and worked cows, then you know that to work cows, you have to collect the horse. The hind legs must come under the point of gravity. You might not necessarily have the horse in a frame up here. He might be in a more elongated frame down there, for example, cutting, but nonetheless, he's collected. and you're using that energy in 3 dimensions. This, of course, translates very, very well to fighting hand to hand with a sword. So from there, we begin to see the first close order combat cavalry, but also very quickly, we see the silhouette of the horse going from very horizontal to the butt down and the poll, the ears being the highest point. There's quite a few reasons for this. If you want to spin a horse on the hind legs, if you want to lash out with the front legs, and if you want to use the front of the horse as a shield for yourself, and a lot of early cavalry manuals talk about this, then that's where you want the horse. But also the horse tends to kind of go there naturally in these play, fighting, dancing, mating behaviors that they do naturally in nature. Okay, so we start with the Sintashta, and it seems that we can stick around there and those related tribes of the Western Steppe. It branches out. Around that time, something else is going on in the world, and not far away. Just to the south of there, in the same way that the Vikings looked down from Scandinavia at England and Scotland and Ireland and the Mediterranean, France, and went, there's a lot of good stuff down there, let's go get some. And they would get in their longships and go and raid. Similarly, these steppe horsemen seem to have looked at the early cities of Mesopotamia, what we think of as Babylon, what we think of as the Akkadian cities in what's now Iraq and Iran, where the Tigris and Euphrates come together. Those are the earliest cities that we know of. They went down there and they raided them. And the people down there were not horse people, but they had a lot of money. And very quickly they realized these mounted riders from the north, it's pointless to go up there and try and conquer them because there's nothing up there. It's just like dudes and grass. However, they make very, very good soldiers. Let's employ them against each other, because of course all these cities were always at war with each other. And that's how the cavalry as we know it begins. Okay, so we're starting in the steppe with livestock work, and then inter-tribal raiding, and then selectively breeding horses for this higher wither, this shorter back, this more trainability, gradually training this 3-dimensional dressing thing in to bring the hind legs under so that you can work your livestock, so that you can steal your neighbor's livestock and fight him off while you do it, and then going down to the cities of Mesopotamia and making mayhem down there. All right. From mayhem to professional soldiery and cavalry. Where does it go from there? Well, it doesn't go to Europe. So we think of riding dressage as a white people thing. We think of it as a European thing. It doesn't seem to have really developed that way. The people on the steppe, okay, they're Indo-Europeans. Then it goes down into the Middle East. Then it goes east. Why does it go east? Because that's where the money was. That's where the civilizations were. That's where the people were who were either worth raiding or worth selling your services to. So the Indus Valley civilizations and the Western Indian civilizations, and of course China. And if you go to this day, for example, into Rajasthan and the Punjab, and you go, for example, to the Pushkar fair, you will see dressage being done in a very tribal context. You will see people playing drums and playing old instruments, and horses dancing in piaffe, in passage, in terre-à-terre, in Spanish walk, in all sorts of other lost movements, dancing on their hind legs and so on. And you'll see the mounted combat being done as well. It went east because there wasn't much going on in Europe at that time. So it's going east right around when? Right around sort of 2000 BC, 1500 BC, etc. And one of the reasons why we know that the Mesopotamian cities were the cradle of all of this was that in 1350-ish BC, a guy, a dead dude, a guy called Kikkuli, wrote down a cavalry manual on clay tablets in what's called cuneiform script. And those have been found, or at least fragments of them have been found. So if you go on the internet and look up Kikkuli with lots of Ks, K-U-K-K-U-L-I, I believe, you'll find some of the stuff in there. And there's stuff in there about fitness, how to train the driving horse, the cavalry horse, even teaching flying changes, that sort of thing. Where else did it go? Egypt. And of course, from Egypt out to all the other places that the Egyptians went. So up into what was what's now Israel, Judea, across into North Africa, and so on. These are light, hot-blooded desert horses. The original ones would have been the ancestors of what we'd now call the Turkomans, Achaltekes, quite similar to our modern thoroughbreds, just smaller. And of course the Arabian horses as well, and the Barbs, the mountain Arabians. And it seems that the Barbs, I want you to hold the word Barb in your head, are the ones that come to dominate later on. And if you're thinking about your Iberian horses, your Andalusians, your PREs, your Lusitanos, they're Barbs. Okay? All right. So the Egyptians blow the whole thing up. And right about the end of those early dynasties, in the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, so now we're at about 900 to 700 BC, we get the flowering of Mycenaean culture in Greece. And the Greeks owe a lot to the Persians, and they owe the new people in Mesopotamia. They give themselves a new name every 150 years, but they're basically the same people who've always been there. Big, powerful empires based around Babylon. And the Egyptians. And the Greeks borrow basically their math, their science, their trade, the religious pantheon to a large degree from Egypt and from Mesopotamia, and a lot of the culture. And with it, of course, horses. This brings us to the first book on horsemanship that we know of in Europe. So some thousands of years after the whole thing has begun on the border of Europe and Asia and then gone into Asia, now it's come into Europe, and we meet this man, Xenophon. So a lot of people think that Xenophon is the father of dressage. Well, clearly he's not. We've got Kikkuli long before him and a lot of unnamed people. And he himself says that he learned the bulk of his trade in Persia. Now, why was that? So the Greek culture was very much tied in with the culture of what's now Turkey. They called it Asia Minor then. It was all kind of one civilization at that time. So you had Greek cities all the way down the west coast of Turkey and quite far into there and even up into the Black Sea. And they were coming into contact with the steppe people, including female warriors on horseback, Amazons. And they didn't like them at all because there were women who were way too independent. So they had to have lots and lots of mythologies, the Greeks, about how people like Hercules and Theseus and so on go up there and defeat the Amazons, but they didn't actually. And by the way, the old grave mounds from that time that had been excavated of mounted warriors buried with their horses from up there on the Ukrainian steppe, where the Greeks had their little colonies, with tattooed skin and all their weapons. Turns out about 50% of those burials are female. So high status mounted warriors, not necessarily male, in fact 50% female. That's something which threatened patriarchal culture. Okay, so the Greeks and the Persians share somewhat of a common culture. And the Persians are always looking at Greece going, I think we kind of need to make that part of the Persian Empire. And the Greeks are always looking at Persia going, there's a lot of money to be made over there, but we don't want those guys coming over here and actually occupying us. So a whole series of wars just kicks off. And Xenophon himself is an interesting dude for many reasons, not just because he's a dead dude that did ponies, but he's also a dead dude who is famous for two other things. If you go to West Point Military Academy in the USA, or if you go to Sandhurst Military Academy in the UK, you'll learn about Xenophon, because Xenophon is known as the master of the tactical retreat, how to get your army out of trouble without losing your own army and while dealing maximum damage on the army that's pursuing you. Why? We'll get into that in a minute. He's also known as a philosopher. So this dude here was the student of another dead dude and the best buddy of another dead dude. His best buddy was a dead dude called Plato. Might have heard of that guy. And their mutual professor was a dead dude called Socrates, who you may know. So all of these guys were from the same time, from the same class. And Xenophon is often credited with having started Stoic philosophy. So the philosophers know about him, the military historians know about him, and tacticians, and the horse people know about him. but none of them know that he was actually equally versed in all of those things. And in fact, a lot of the dead dudes that we're going to go into were, because horses, of course, have always been at the center of aristocratic culture, government culture, warfare, diplomacy, art, so the humanities. So a lot of these people actually had a foot in had many feet, I guess, many of these fields. And it's only kind of lately that we've all gotten a little bit, I only do horses, I only do horses. We're terrible like this, horse people, aren't we? The old masters that we want to learn from, they were much more eclectic. They were interested in all kinds of things, and they saw how horsemanship really crossed over into all of these other areas. So Xenophon writes a book, and his book is worth a read. You can get it in translation. You'll see there isn't a ton of dressage in it. He talks about doing certain movements on the parade ground, and he talks about the horse in war. He also talks a lot about jumping and the need to have a horse that's sound across country and all of that, and how to bomb-proof your horse. But what he really talks about that makes a big impact on later generations is the need to be kind. He says the horse responds to love. He says there are other people out there who train them by whacking them around. He said that's no good, that doesn't work. You're going to need this horse to get your ass out of trouble when the shit hits the fan. And he knew about that, because the reason why he's the master of the tactical retreat is he was also a mercenary. He's a philosopher, he's a horseman, he's a military guy. Okay, he's also a mercenary. And he got hired as part of a 10,000 strong Greek force to go over and take part in a coup against the Persian king by the brother of the Persian king. And guess what? It failed. And he found himself with those 10,000 Greeks stranded in near modern day Baghdad, which is a bazillion miles away from Greece, on having fought for the wrong side, having to get home with his people. And he did. And that book is called The Anabasis. It's worth a read. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on Amazon, The Anabasis. And he describes all those military battles, all those cavalry skirmishes, and how they used the cavalry to protect themselves as well as to attack the enemy and so on, and all the skirmishing and flanking. He learned it and he perfected it there from locals he was taught. Then when he got back home, he continued his military career, but he also lived on a country estate, so he was hunting and all of that stuff, and, you know, overseeing his livestock. When he decided to write this Art of Horsemanship book, he decided to do it because he said, actually, I'm by no means the best at this here in Greece. And he keeps referencing a guy called Simon of Athens. He said, this dude, if you really want to know, it's Simon. Simon's the man, it's Simon. But Simon doesn't want to write a book. So I'm going to write a book, even though I'm not as good as Simon. So he writes this book, and this has now entered the canon as the sort of first book on dressage. But as we know, it's much, much, much older than that. All right. The classical world, the ancient world, of course, expands west along the Mediterranean, goes into North Africa, goes over into Spain. Not just the Greeks, but the Romans. Now, when the Romans begin their big expansion, they, of course, are just developing Greek culture further than the Greeks had themselves. And a lot of their emphasis was the West. They go and they conquer Gaul, which is modern-day France. They go up into southern Germany, where I'm sitting, actually, at the bottom of my garden. There's a route that many, many barbarian tribes have taken to go across the Rhine, and the Romans were... I'm sitting actually in the Roman Empire right now, but if I go 3 or 4 kilometers that way, there's a big old reconstructed Roman tower. That's the end of the empire. So the Romans needed to govern a much bigger area, and of course they were all about constantly adapting their military technology. The Greeks had had some colonies over in what's now Spain and Portugal. The Romans developed them, and they discovered there a horse that was better than the horses that were coming out of that Central Asian, Western, Eastern European area that we talked about, those Turkomans, those Achatekes. Better horses than that. Why? The Iberian horse, or the ancestor, the barbs that we were talking about. Well, most of the Mediterranean is mountains to the sea. That kind of characterizes a lot of that geography. So a lot of it isn't really horse country, you know, what we think of as big flat pastures or whatever. However, there are some exceptions. One of these exceptions is where two big river deltas come out, one in Spain and one in what is now Portugal. The Guadalquivir River in Spain, which comes out at Cadiz, and the Tagus, which comes out at Lisbon in Portugal. The floodplains of those rivers were really, and still are, big and flat and wide, and very good pasture and lots of wild horses. Those wild horses evolved next to large herds of wild cattle, what we would call the aurochs, and which are now the ancestors of, which were then the ancestors of what is now the fighting bulls of Spain and Portugal. Hyper aggressive. Why were these horses and these cows living together in the wild? Well, for the same reason that in Africa, you get large herds of wildebeest living with large herds of zebra living with large herds of Cape buffalo, because there's safety in numbers. What did they need safety from? Well, it's easy to forget how wild Europe actually still is in many places, and certainly how wild it was back then. The main predator of southern Europe at that time for horses would not actually have been wolves, as we might have thought, but lion. Lions, what we now think of as the Eurasian lion, only exists in its wild form now in a very small population in Western India, in the Gir forest. But up until about the very early medieval period, you still got lion all the way through, even the Balkans, certainly into Turkey, and originally it had been in Iberia and southern Italy even, and Greece. So these horses and these wild cows were being preyed upon by big cats, and they're hiding in the marshes, going to spring on them. So safety in numbers, okay, well, that's great. But unfortunately, these cows are hyper aggressive. Well, this is a problem for the horses, because each of these cows, rather like a Cape buffalo, carries an invisible territory, a bubble around itself, which it's totally cool with you as long as you stay outside that bubble. But if you accidentally put your foot over that bubble, and that bubble could be bigger or smaller, depending on if it's a bull or if the cow has a calf or whatever, they're going to come, they're going to attack you right away. They come with the horns low, they're going to disembowel you and toss you. So these horses, over a couple of million years, evolved to have this extraordinary flexibility through the shoulders and the hips, so they could go whoop, whoop. I'm good over here. You good? Okay, yeah, I'm good. You're good. Fine. Keep grazing. So this incredible flexibility, of course, made them amazing battle horses and easier to dress, easier to put those hindquarters underneath than a lot of the horses that have been coming out of Asia. So they very, very quickly became the battle horse of choice, particularly for the officer class in the Roman Empire. And the Ibero-Celtic tribes that now we would think of as the people down in Spain and Portugal, who then subsequently mixed with others, but back then they were primarily Celtic, had evolved really good ways of training these horses as well. The Romans took this up and they exported it out through the rest of their empire. I said that in the bottom of my garden, which I'm actually looking at through the windows behind where you're watching me, there's this road that follows a narrow valley, goes into the heart of the Roman Empire over the River Rhine and in. Well, and around 400 AD, the beginning of the 5th century, a whole bunch of dudes, actually not just dudes, remember we had it on the steppe, we had a mounted warrior, female warriors as well, all came pouring into the Roman Empire down at the bottom of my garden. There they are going past right now. If you believe like I do that time is vertical, not linear, they're probably still going past right now. And they poured in on horseback into the heart of the Roman Empire and began what we think of as the Middle Ages. They carved out their own kingdoms inside the Western Empire. They gave the names to the countries that we think of today. The Franks, France, the Lombards, that's northern Italy, Lombardy, the Burgundians, well, of course, that's eastern France, the Aves, Suabia, España, and Swabia in southern Germany, etc. And Vandals, Andalusia. Some people think it's Al-Andalus, the land of light, but it seems that etymologically, the name of Andalusia actually relates to the Germanic tribe, the Vandals, who poured through here and then into Germany and then down into France and down to Spain and then across the Mediterranean, and the Goths. Okay, and these people all brought in the original form of horsemanship from the Sintashta people. So they all knew this way to dress a horse as well. And this kind of massive age of cavalry warfare that we think of as the Middle Ages, knights on horseback, the mounted warrior dominating the scene, begins. However, literacy kind of dies at this time, except in the monasteries and a few other places like that. So the works on horsemanship, unfortunately, don't really exist. We see something around the 14th century popping up in Portugal from King Edward Duarte, who says, oh, we learned all this stuff from the Moors, from the Arabs. Well, that's a clue. Most of the medieval texts are, in fact, in Arabic, and because that was a much more literate culture than Europe at the time. And so if you want to read the medieval texts on dressage, you kind of have to learn Arabic. However, my great friend Philip Wirtz, who I'll do a shout out to, who used to be a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, turned me on to these, and they're certainly out there, but not many of them are in translation. But that's why you see the rise of the Ottoman Empire as well as a great cavalry force, because of course that old Persian tradition, the Ottomans just take over from the Persians, never died. So this brings us to the beginning of the early modern or Renaissance period. And we're going to stop right here because it's from the Renaissance that everything really flourishes, and all of the dead dudes that we currently follow as old masters, from there into the Baroque, and the Baroque into the early modern and the 19th century and blah, blah, blah. Okay, that all begins there. So this video, I hope, gave you an overview of where the whole thing started, how it started, some clues into how livestock riding, therefore Western riding, might be related to dressage. It certainly is. How it has its roots in martial arts, how it started in mostly Asia and then came over into Europe. Names like Kikkuli, who Xenophon was, etc. The fact that in the Middle Ages, most of the texts are in Arabic. This gives you an overview of the ancient thing, starting from the Sintashtas. We will make more specific videos later on the tack they used, the exercises they used, and so on in this ancient period. Don't worry, we're going to nerd out a lot. For those of you who are nerds like me, it's going to be great. We're going to keep going. But our next video that we're going to make in this series will deal with the Renaissance to the Baroque. And the third one will go from the Baroque into the modern, and then we'll reprise and go through as many of the actual exercises that these old dead dudes used as we possibly can. All right, I hope this was useful. I hope it was entertaining. If you liked it, if you found it in any way helpful, please, please, please give it a thumbs up. Better still, subscribe. This helps massively the channel. Why do we want to help the channel? Because we want to get this information out there. I wish I'd known this stuff when I was in Pony Club. They didn't teach it, let alone how to actually do the things. So it's important that we continue to get this information out there as much as we can. So please like, please subscribe. If you want to, you can come and train with us on our school master horses. We've got a stable of them. You're welcome to contact us about that, and to also join our online course, heliosharmony.com. Go to that. You can learn to train your horse in hand. We're going to talk about in-hand work from the ground, from 0 to piaffe this way, heliosharmony.com. But at the very least, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video.